So welcome to the MeCCSA Radio Studies Network online reading group. This is a Q&A session that we've organised with the two authors of an article that we discussed previously this term. The article is Erased and Misremembered, Exhuming the Colonial Broadcasting of Una Marson. The authors are Yvette Rowe and Anthony Frampton. And I'm delighted to say that they are both here with us this evening. So thank you so much for coming along to talk to us. I did have several colleagues who and people who usually come along to our online reading group, and we did have some questions already, but I'll use those later, because what I'd like to hear about to begin with is how the two of you met and decided to do your research. So if you don't mind telling us that story to begin with, please.
I guess, Yvette, you want me to lead on that?
Yeah. I'll chip in.
Yes, actually, it's quite interesting because I was down working in Jamaica at the time. We were both working lecturers at the University of the West Indies Mona campus and the School of Communication. And we were actually working on a totally different project. And it's a very long-term expanded project that we're working on, looking at the BBC Caribbean service that is no longer in operations. And we wanted to understand how that particular service influenced the practice of journalism throughout the Caribbean, because we noticed some strong connections between the principles, policies, traditions, culture of journalism throughout the Caribbean and the general character of how the BBC Caribbean service was being conducted. So actually, we were in one of our regular meetings. We met, I think, weekly, and we had one of our weekly meetings. And at that meeting, Yvette came to me and Yvette just started talking about Una Marson, and the meeting stopped. And I was like, okay. And, you know, there's this moment, you know, as a scholar where you just need to shut up. So I just kept quiet, and because usually I'm the passionate one and Yvette is usually the one who's the deep listener. And I'm like, okay, so where did that energy come from? And she was so passionate about it and so disturbed by some questions that she had, and she wanted them answered. And I'm like, okay. And I said, okay, we need to drop this project. And initially we were like, she was like, no, I said, no, we need to drop this project because you're onto something. I don't know exactly what yet you're onto, but you're onto something. And the questions you're asking are important. They matter, and they have not been answered. And so we need to spend some time to see what contribution we can make to answering those questions. And if within a month we realize that we're unable to answer them, then we're going to drop them, but we're going to pursue it. Yvette, probably give you a chance if you want to chime in right now.
I think you summed it up. We were obviously wanting to get into the history, the early history of the Caribbean service. And I suppose we didn't anticipate that there would be these kind of holes. But I just found anomalies that worried me in terms of dates, and also that not as much as I might have thought was available about Una Marson when we considered, you know, her contribution to broadcasting and who she was. So it was one of those moments where it should have been, certainly it's always going to be hard work, because if you're going to do your research work, you've got to dig. But it was sort of like we were digging, and then we were hitting rock, and we needed to go and try and find another route to get some of those answers. And I found it, I suppose, more than intriguing, yes, because I was sort of passionate about it. That wanted to get answers to the questions and see if there were more questions that needed to be answered. And it just felt like, why does some of these things not make sense? Why is it this year, but there's no record of this and that? Why is it so hard to piece together this piece of history? And what does that say about the subject that we were looking at? And as I say, it's a part of what we were looking at, but I felt that we needed to give it more attention, which Dr. Frampton allowed us, in fact, to go on that journey.
So which were the archives that you were able to access? I think you discussed Caversham in the article. Did you actually come over to the UK to have a dig?
Well, I came over with the intention of having a dig, and then COVID put paid to those plans back in 2020. And in actual fact, I'm leaving on Monday to go over to the UK to finally get into the Caversham BBC written archive. So we haven't got there yet. We're on our way there, and we have also been, obviously without that, we've been doing what we can from different avenues. And when I did go to England, before I was not able to get to the BBC archives, I was able to get into the British Library, ironically, for one day, because it was like, I got into the British Library, started doing some digging, and then the next day it was, not that that's a major thing, we know we had to go through that. So I was able to make some links in the British Library to some newspapers across the world, where we started to see Una Marson appearing in newspapers in Australia and in New Zealand, and sort of local newspapers. They were giving a summary of what to expect on her broadcast. So we were able to, we had to work around the archives, and in a sense we had to find workarounds. But we could also argue that we had to be very creative about where we went, and it was very funny to say, well, we're going to literature, we're going to plays, we're going to exhibitions, we're looking at where there's a blue plaque, we're looking at where there's a mention about either the program or the personalities, or even, Una Marson as one of the girlfriends of the Empire. So yeah, long answer to the short question. Haven't been there yet. Looking forward to getting in there in the coming weeks.
Josephine, if I can chime in here a little bit, but there's an important lesson there for researchers, I think, especially qualitative researchers, in ensuring that you are serving your methodology, that you are not unwindly and following your own whims and fancies or your own assumptions of where the data should be. So we had spent a lot of time discussing methodology. I think, Yvette, we spent several weeks just discussing how we can get this as rigid as possible, right? And still get the information that we should be getting. And so when we discussed, we went back again, looking at the grounded theory that we had chosen, and we were like, maybe we need to bring grounded theory into conversation with other types of methods, because we looked at grounded theory both as methodology and method. And so we were, and I think this is important, because whereas we were not able to access, when we were extremely disappointed when we could not access the data at the BBC archive, but we didn't give up. And it was that opportunity that led us to a plethora, a labyrinth of other sources that perhaps we would not have explored had we accessed the original data from the BBC archive. I mean, we went into the Jamaica Gleaner, we went to look at different archives at the University of the West Indies, different subject areas to see if Marson works had emerged. We went to literature, because we know there was a lot written about Marson literature. And we wanted to see whether there were connections that were made to broadcasting. And so and I just want to make that point that sometimes when we begin research projects, particularly as qualitative researchers, we get bogged down with being too committed to what we want to know and not in service to what the grounded theory is telling us we ought to look for. And I just thought that was is a very important point, that at least a lesson that we both learned from the experience.
No, that's super useful, because I think a lot of us struggle in radio studies because we are mostly doing either histories or maybe political economy, but yeah, you know, we tend to do qualitative research. Mm-hmm. And so to have this example of how you were agile enough and prepared to go to unexpected places to do your exploring, and then to have all those pieces of evidence tell you what it was about is so useful. I will just say now, Jay, if you want to ask any questions, you're more than welcome to put a hand up or write something in the chat. So do feel free, if you have any questions at any point, please join in. So that in fact was one of the questions that came up during the discussion last month when I was with our colleagues. And the other question was, what stage did you know which theory or methodology you were going to use? So was grounded theory always going to be what you were going to be working with, or had you thought that you might take a sort of historical look or cultural?
Yes, okay, so I think Yvette might expect me to take the lead on that since. Okay, so we initially thought that we were going to use grounded theory as perhaps the main and maybe the only methodology that we would concentrate on. But that's the dynamic of grounded theory. If you're truly doing grounded theory, you are constantly iterative, meaning that you're constantly reviewing what you're doing. And so we realized that grounded theory alone as a method, and it's important to make the distinction between grounded theory as a methodology and method. And it was the methodology of grounded theory that guided us to the fact that the method of grounded theory alone was insufficient. Right? And it is very important. And so by constantly asking ourselves questions of what is it we are bothered about? What is troubling? And Yvette was the key in that, because she was always asking the important questions. And we said, but we need to make a divergence if we are going to look for that. And so we realized we had to talk about document analysis. And we realized, okay, but document analysis alone may not give us answers to that. We may need some interviews to corroborate some of the things that we are finding. And so it was, and that is the thing about a project like that, it took much longer than we initially thought it would have taken. But because we both, and the passion became contagious. So we both became so enthralled by the research that we were doing that we wanted answers. And so we were constantly working on trying to find these answers and constantly being reflexive about what we need to change and how we need to reposition ourselves to get what is bothering us. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah.
For me, I think you summed it up. This idea that we opened up, it opened itself, the grounded theory, to the fact that we realized that it wasn't going to be just that. We'd have to bring in other things. But I think it was very important in what we were doing, given the landscape, that we needed to be led by, the data and the material, because we knew that, I mean, generally in research, yes, you know something and then you start to ask more questions and so on. But it was very much the case in this situation that you needed to know a certain amount to then ask other questions. And sometimes you'd have to go back and say, wait a minute, the data seemed to lead us here, but now that we've got more data, we realize, you know, it might have been easy enough to say, oh, the program she was on started in the Second World War, which in that time span it did, but we noticed that, you know, a shorthand, which was, oh, wait a minute, the Second World War sort of started in 1939. And then the shorthand is the program started in the Second World War, and then suddenly things just didn't make that distinction that it was, but it wasn't in 1939. And this is what happened in 1941, this is what happened in 1942 and 1943. And you had to interrogate this idea that, yes, this war started in 1939, but when did Caribbean troops start coming? When did she actually get a job as a program assistant? When did Colonial the West Indies and that series of programs, that umbrella, when did it actually start? And I think that opened that up. That was just the historical stuff. But as we delve further into her experience, that's where we see other things have to come in, because it wasn't just looking at the historical, you know, we call it the misremembering, but as we got the more data, we saw that other factors impacted on her life and performance and needed to be covered elsewhere.
I mean, there are a lot of discrepancies, clearly, that you came up with. Were there discrepancies, Yvette, when you first were really excited and started talking about Una Marson with Anthony? Did you already know that there were some discrepancies, or were you really surprised at what then did come out as you did your further research?
I identified some discrepancies, but I didn't think there would be quite as much divergence. I think that, you know, we said, you know, of all the places where they're supposed to probably have records of things, we thought, you know, that they should ought to be able to get their records right is at the BBC. So we were kind of a little bit astounded that it hadn't quite happened like that. And I think what can happen is, as I mentioned, the shorthand, where, you know, and that's what's really important. We may at times not know that the answer may not be available, but in those times we also need to flag that the possibilities, you know, may be different. So we weren't sure whether we could get the answers, but we knew that it was not enough to say that everything was as it should be, just because of the discrepancies that I mentioned when the war started, the fact that nothing really much, you know, nothing much happened, you know, after September 1939. We know that we were really going to 1940 for that. But as we went along, then we found euphemisms, and I suppose there's lots of reasons why certain material didn't want to maybe touch on the reasons why Marson left. You know, the whole idea of the breakdown and those issues with her health. So we could see where, you know, an earlier information might have just wanted to, for whatever reason, not really to go into too much detail about what happened. But what we found later on is that casually, and this is not in scholarly stuff, but people would sort of say, oh, she didn't get married. But there is evidence to suggest that she did in 1960, you know, get married to a dentist in Washington. And so what troubled us was the discrepancies. What troubled us was also that, yeah, there shouldn't necessarily be that kind of blasé-ness that this is, this is fact, when perhaps it is that we don't know the facts, but we need to know that we don't know, if you see what I mean. Rather than, if you don't, you know, if you're not sure, then you kind of leave it out or ask the questions or try to find the answers and even present potential answers, even if you can't categorically say this is what happened because we weren't there. And of course, we are looking at this from quite a way away, so we do have some disadvantages, you know, of who we can talk to, because we're doing it so many decades after.
So we did notice that you did make some really strong evidence-based claims, which which were quite exciting, and we could see your the passion throughout, and you really sort of cut across political, cultural, social aspects of things. And I think on page 65, which I think is in your methodology, and you describe triangulating the data, which is great because it's, you know, it's kind of a visual, isn't it? And you've got lots of all the different sources that you described earlier as well, like the archives and presentations and interviews, and other aspects that were lacking, because you mentioned the scarcity of artifacts on Marson's work, but you were still able to find some narratives in that, and then you describe very clearly your bringing grounded theory into direct conversation with document analysis to augment the rigor with which we approach our review of the secondary data. And Anthony referred to that earlier. It's so important to be rigorous in our research. And then you mentioned that you were going to focus on the social processes, that felt quite important to you. And one of the questions that then came up was, if you were focusing on the social processes, was there anything that you then didn't focus on? So was there a cost of focusing on the social?
That's a very good question, actually, because yes, there are limitations to what we can do, limitations that are inherent based on the nature of what you're trying to study. For example, we didn't have access, we didn't have enough extant data. We ourselves are looking at it decades after. So there are, if you focus on the social, there are institutional issues that you're going to miss out, right? And systemic issues that you're unable to look at. And so we have to admit that it's a project, and a project cannot be all encompassing. There will be stuff that you'll have to leave out, right? There'll be stuff that you won't be able to look at. And that is why we spent a lot of time delineating the scope of what we were going to do. We were not able to look at a lot of stuff, and throughout our methodology, you realize we spent a lot of time trying to explain some of the challenges that we had and how we were going around it. So as I say that, I'm thinking of Adichie's point about the single story. So there's never one story, right? We were just trying to say, this is just our story of how we engaged what was available to us in our inquiry of Marson's work. And we engaged because we were bothered. We were bothered because there were too many gaps, right? And I think it's a good way to look at it in terms of thinking of it as our story. And that is the story that was presented to us and the story that we were able to tell based on engaging the data. So yes, people, for example, who are interested in political economy may have wanted us to look a little more about some of the systemic and structural issues that may have contributed. For example, why was the BBC's archive not able to have any of Marson's work? Well, there are a lot of structural and systemic inquiries that could have maybe exculpated the BBC from not having Marson's work. But this was beyond the scope of what we were trying to do. And this was actually not what was bothering us.
So,
I wonder if I could ask.
Yes, of course.
I wonder
yes.
if I could ask a question. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for your for this document, which I read with great interest. I'm one of Richard's students. I'm an MA student at Goldsmiths. And I have a broader question, really, which is what lessons can be learned from the nature of archival media now, given that so much has disappeared, and what is the responsibility of broadcasters more generally to ensure that that history is maintained?
Yvette, you want me to take that one?
Yeah. I think that obviously the lessons are that whatever is still, available, efforts, need to be made to, to preserve it and to make it accessible. And because we don't know what will be useful. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why there's lots of other reasons why things weren't kept. But now we know, decades after, how we wish things were kept. I think going forward in the future, the challenge is not going to be the material, because we are now in there's so much data, there's so many things being recorded. Our problem is going to be to know how to go through it, to preserve it in a different way. Not physically, it'll probably be around, or digitally, but there'll be so much of it. How will we pull it out? But the lesson, I think, going back to whatever is still available, is maybe to use the technology to find ways to ensure that we do save stuff, and that we save any of the stuff that is still available. I think one of the problems is that when we're in the moment, and we know this because we're both radio practitioners or journalism practitioners, that when we're in the moment and we're doing our work, it's the news today. But as we look back over the decades, it becomes useful, archive and historical data. But often, maybe we shouldn't be left to the people who are creating it in that moment to look at the value of it. Maybe it needs to be other people who are going to say, hey, great, you just get on with creating what you're creating today. Let us gather some of this stuff and preserve it, because we know there's a value to it if we have it. And we see from the work that we've done, it's like, oh my, there's only this little bit of Una Marson and other people who were involved in the program. There's really no recordings of it. There's a little bit that's been released on the internet, on David Henley's web page, her interview with the band leader, and there's so much that's lost. So the lesson really needs to be that you've got to try to preserve it, and if it's not there, how can we try to reconstruct the history with what we do have?
I just want to add one more thing, that at least in reflecting on the process, sometimes we get lost in following prescriptions on how we should do our research. But one thing I realized from this Marson research is that, it made me very, very appreciative of the fact that archive is not an objective marker, right? Not because something is there as a time capsule, that it is itself an objective marker of reality, right? That I think for young researchers, that's something that I think should be driven to them. There's context. This archive represents a choice. A choice was made at a particular time to capture a particular moment of history that particular way. And with choices come other things. What has been left out? Why was it left out? Right? What are the other socio-political issues that come into play in why that particular piece of evidence exists? Gender, for us, for example, it was very clear to us that were it, for example, a Black native Caribbean person working at the BBC who were probably responsible for doing that archive, I doubt that Una Marson would have been left out, right? So when we're doing research and we're looking at archival stuff, it is important to look at not only what exists, but the context surrounding what contributed to that particular existence of that time capsule, that piece of reality.
Yeah, excellent points there. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of food for thought. Do you have anything else, Jay, that you'd like to ask at this point?
Yes. So on 67, you talk about how the BBC's management went to remove or asked for Marson to remove from on-air broadcasting and expunge any production credits given to her, which is quite a startling statement by any means. And was this in, where did we find this is essentially my question. Was it in some sort of archive? Was it, you know, because it's such a big statement to make. That's my question, sorry.
Well, it's described to the overseas department as Rendell, and we got it from I think from our literature, and it wasn't a memo, but it was a letter written, because at this time, as we go on to say, she was under pressure from within our own compatriots about the so-called bias towards Jamaican participants. She was at loggerheads with the West Indian committee, who wanted her to be more balanced in the people that she was having on the program. So this is coming from the articles that have been written, and people who had obviously seen the material in the archive.
Thank you. Can I just then ask you, given everything that you've written, how has your perception of Marston changed? Because of course, this is a very theoretical analysis of what went on around her life. But the core of it, of course, is the person herself, Una Marson. What has surprised you about the research that you've done, and how has your perception of her changed?
I think that it comes down to there are these things that happen. Yes, she's the first black producer at the BBC, and she worked on this program, and she was very much lauded back home in the Caribbean in her heyday. And for me, it's seeing that it's more than just those facts. I mean, it's trying to imagine, of course we can't imagine, but everything about her also had a sort of a pressure. So as we mentioned, it wasn't enough just to look at her as a colonial citizen, the colonial her status, or her gender, or her race. All of these came into play, and we see, you know, aspects of that are her strengths, but also where she has a job to do. But there's more to it than that. There's a job to do, which even her BBC supporters and superiors acknowledged, that she faced racism from some of her colleagues, and the intersections of what she has to deal with. It brings her out. You know, when tries to, for me, what my perception of her changes in terms of just seeing the real person in this historical situation, this moment in time, and really thinking about, you know, how hard it is to do a job anyway, and wondering about the internal struggles that would come here as someone in an against moving as an activist, and then it being in the heart of empire and having a sort of job to do. It's almost, you have to put that on hold in order to deal with it. And there she is, these paradoxes. She's in the heart of empire, broadcasting back to the Caribbean, and trying to develop, this voice. And sometimes when we look back on history, it's not just, there's a different way of thinking and a different point, that the person is operating in this point in history, and various things that have come after haven't happened yet. So it's to also try to get into that mindset of being there at the BBC, so far from home, in the midst of war, in the Blitz, running around and putting these programs together. For me, she becomes even more fascinating.
If I can chime in here, I think those of us who are interested in studying leaders of political movements, so people who are interested in creating transformational change, and some of the compromises that they inevitably have to make, would be well served to study Marson's life. Because when I look back at the work that we examined on Marson, I saw this person who was very invested in a particular political ideology, very invested in a particular political movement, who took actionable steps to activate those political philosophies. And then I saw this person going through a transformation where they became more rational about some of the things they wanted to achieve. And so this notion of working within, working outward and working within with radical movements or radical ideologies, I kept just looking at some of the things, compromises Marson made, the way she navigated this, which must have been a very, very sensitive environment for her to work in. I mean, if you read some of the comments that her colleagues were making about her, and here she was with this idea of very radical progressive racial politics, and she had to be part of that same system that suppressed her very identity. And yet she wanted to remain, she really wanted to stay. She had opportunities to live, but she stayed, and she was determined to make a contribution that she must have felt was important and in some way would have advanced her ideologies. So when I look at Marson, I think of people who study, those of us, especially those of us who study radical racial politics, would be well served to look at some of the choices Marson had and the ways in which she navigated her realities. Josephine, I think you're muted if you're talking, yeah.
Sorry, thank you. I clicked, but I clicked in an empty space. How do you feel about the circumstances surrounding her departure from the UK and from the BBC?
Yvette, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, the prevailing kind of thought on that, and it's interesting to note that when we were first doing our research, a number of the information that we had was being very circumspect and about that time. And later on, we began to see information that sort of said, that it was first of all her depression, and then mental illness, and actually some go as far as saying that she was sectioned, and that the BBC was assisted with the passage, and that when you read the biography by Derek Corley, it talks about how they kind of had to try to really get her on the ship to go back to the Caribbean, and that was going to be the ending of her time in the Caribbean. That maybe she might have thought that she could recuperate and perhaps come back, and it also fits in with a lot. I mean, people talk about the pressure that she must have been under. I was just recently looking at some other information that seems to suggest that she might have had a breakdown back in the 1930s, because she came in early in the 1930s after the success of her first play, and then she goes back. And I've just been reading some information that's suggesting that she might have gone back for her health back there. So it's, how do I feel about it? It's something that we'll probably not really get to the bottom of, but it's fairly understandable that a great deal of pressure she was under, because I think, as you mentioned, and it is something that many people grew up with, this idea as a Black woman, that you are an example to the race, so that the pressure to do well is not just for yourself, but if you don't do well, it reflects on the race. And we're looking back at a time when these arguments were very important. So it may have been personally devastated, and overall that a tremendous pressure to try to succeed. And then we didn't have to. It wasn't in the scope of what we were doing to discuss that whole thing of the idea of mental illness and Black women, and that's a part, something that we couldn't get into. But I think that may be fertile ground for other people to look at what that meant. And I think some people have touched on that, to be fair.
Anthony, do you have any?
Not really. I mean, it's sort of, well, I have just a feeling that just from my engagement with the material, one of the interesting things for us is when we were looking at Marson's interaction with the public when she went back to Jamaica. So you get some interesting insights of what some of her thoughts relating to her work and the general work of media and broadcasting, because when she went back to Jamaica, she was constantly writing in the papers about media performance, changes in the media dynamics. And I kept wondering whether this was sort of an expression of loss in some way, or was an extension of that loss she might have felt when she left the BBC, because she tried to get back into working regularly, but she remained on the margins. And I just kept wondering while I was reading that, how that must have felt for her, having to comment from the sidelines after being such an iconic figure, not just in Caribbean media, but in transborder media, and to just be relegated to commentaries, by the way, letters to the editor that I'm sure very few people paid attention to. But I felt that she wanted to be more involved, that she felt she had a contribution to make, that she felt that she had something to say. And I was wondering whether, and again, that is ripe for study by someone who might be interested in that particular type of work. But I was wondering whether that was some sort of extension from that persona that she had to give up when she left the BBC service.
In terms of all the information and all the insights and evidence that you collected, is all of that in this article, or have you got other findings that you're going to share with us later, or will you do more research and then add to that?
Well, Yvette just made one, is that we will constantly, I remember several weeks, we were asking ourselves whether we can find a connection between the way she was taken off from the BBC to some of the personal challenges that she was having. And that's another important lesson for qualitative researchers. Sorry if I keep chatting with those lessons, because it was very self-revealing as well. So it's like you were saying, you have a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, they frustrated her. Oh, they made her develop all this stress, and it led to depression. But yeah, it is that Yvette is finding out, as we continue to study, that she had challenges with mental health even before she took on that challenge at the BBC. So other people who I think who are more skilled than us, who are more knowledgeable than us in that area, would probably be able to help with further studies to extend the study beyond the limitations of what we were able to do.
I think for me, one of the things is that you asked if there's more information. One of the things that I found interesting and enlightening is I can't help but keep searching. I know we've done this article and we're doing the project. And what's interesting is that we've seen some more interest in her broadcasting being expressed in those areas. I mean, the plaque, there's a library in South London, I think, going to be named after her. There's the mural at Alexandra Palace. I'm seeing more notes and blogs and people in different educational settings wanting to talk about her life. And what's interesting for me as well is that when we talked about where to go, you talked about the archive, she's mentioned up in, I think it's the Africans in Yorkshire and Hull archive. And I'm going to Birmingham to look at an archive up there. But there's more. So when we first started and we were doing our searches around, it wasn't a lot. It's getting more, coming out from there. So as I was saying, I just was looking at some articles just the other day because I can't help but just see how it's going. So we have more that we refer to, and obviously it's part of a bigger project. So, but we had to keep within our lines, as it were, in order to really try to do as what we could within our lines. And I'd like to colour outside the lines, but we need to colour inside the lines. But there's a lot of material that needs connection that we maybe can't put. And as Anthony said, it's maybe to others to look at some of the other aspects, just as it has happened with the rest of her life, which fertile ground because she was doing a lot of groundbreaking things in different areas. But we're interested in the broadcasting.
And just to support that, we don't know whether it's correlated to our article, but we just found it quite interesting. And when we had begun studying Una, there was hardly any, this is what drove us, there was hardly anything about her broadcasting. There was tremendous focus on her literature. But even we participated in some of those engagements that celebrated her literature, but there was hardly anything on her broadcasting since the publication of the paper. And again, we're not claiming any correlation of causality. We're just saying that we're noting now that even the BBC itself is starting to show interest in recognizing Marston's contribution to broadcasting. So that's, again, it's another lesson for researchers that even when you might be frustrated initially, you may invariably become a trigger for other things that can help the politics of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did a quick search earlier before I started the meeting, and there's so much now. So much material and celebration. And yeah, so I think your work really has, revitalized, I know that there were, as you said, some pockets of research, but there's so much there, and so much interest and so much demand now. And as Jay will attest, it is being taught at universities, specifically around this woman and others, looking at other unsung pioneers, if you like, and big contributors. So I think we should probably draw this wonderful meeting to a close. Your article was really well written and had lots and lots of very useful information in there, both in the structure of how you did your research and then all the findings. Thank you so much for spending time with us in this Q&A today. And do you have any final words? Does Jay have any final words first?
I just wanted to say thank you so much. I found the paper really illuminating. And even though we had studied her, I think there were lots of threads there that I hadn't explored. And certainly the notion of that internal schism that she was going through and the challenges she faced, both internally and externally, and also the sort of tribal, quote unquote, pressures that she would have felt were really illuminated in the paper. So thank you, because there's, as you said, there's lots more to do, and it really is a wonderful piece of work that I'm sure will have longevity and will contribute to the canon of her work. Thank you.
Thank you. In closing, I just want to make just one point in that I think Yvette and I discussed in that the process of publication in itself somehow is like a dance of politics in itself. So not in terms of just how you yourself engage the rubrics and requirements of publishing, but the compromises that you're required to make based on the methodology that you've chosen. So for example, one key point we had, and we wrangled over this for an entire night. It might seem very simple, but it was very crucial for us. I mean, we just dropped our hands eventually and said, okay, we'll go with it. But we had an extensive discussion on that one little point, where in Marson's poem, I think, To the Keys, I think that was in 1938, she had a poem where she wrote about her racial identity and how British society was engaging her as a Black woman. And in that poem, she had several references of the word nigger. And we were required to remove, to replace that word with asterisks, as you would see and we said to ourselves, but when you read that poem, that the word itself was very critical to the message that Marson was trying to convey. All right. And we discussed that for, I think, more than an hour. And we were like, yes, but if we're doing that, what are we doing to Marson? And are we invariably contributing to the problem that we highlighted in the paper itself? In that, by subscribing to what is being required of us, the institutional dictates of publication, aren't we whitewashing Marson's own experience in the process? And so I wanted to make that point with, especially those of us who are studying things on the margins. Sometimes you make decisions and you have to be okay with it, because you know what we told ourselves in the end, that Marson herself had to make those decisions.
Yeah.
And she had to make those compromises, and we felt, well, she would be okay with it too in the end. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you so much. Really important. So we'll close. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate your time, and stay in touch, and we'll try and follow your progress, and let us know. And when you are here, let us know if you have a spare moment between London and Hull and Birmingham. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Josephine.